the Churches of Christ present Bible Talk.
Jesus was clear in John 4:23 and 24 that true worship and the worship which the Father seeks is a worship offered in spirit and in truth. Sadly, in today's world, one doesn't have to go very far before they find some cheap representations of worship. David once had a chance to offer God cheap worship, and he refused, saying, "I will not offer that which costs me nothing." Cheap worship will be the topic of our study today, so stay tuned after this song of praise. Hello again, and thank you for tuning into Bible Talk. As always, we thank you for your generous support of our program, and we ask that you continue to remember us in your prayers as we seek to deliver God's message to the world. And I want to thank you, as always, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to come into your home and to present a message from God's holy Word. In our home, when we go to buy groceries, there are some things that we're willing to steer away from the name brand and buy the off-brand version in order to save a little bit of money. And sometimes what we've found is that with some of these items, you end up buying something that was cheaper, that some might consider to be an imitation, and yet it is just as good or better at times than the more expensive name brand. And so it just goes to show you that sometimes the cheaper option is just as good, if not better, than the real McCoy, so to speak. And that's good when it comes to trying to save a little money in your grocery budget, but when it comes to worship, cheaper is not better, nor is it an acceptable equivalent. Worship, if done correctly, costs us something. Worship, if done correctly, costs us energy as we seek to put heart into the service. Again, Jesus said, "They that worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth." In order to worship God in spirit, I must be putting energy and heart into the service. And that requires energy. That costs me something. If we're worshiping God correctly, then it costs me time. And time is the most precious and one of the most valuable resources that we have. If we're worshiping God correctly, then we're setting aside time for worship. We're setting aside time to prepare for worship, to think about and to pray about and to prepare for worship beforehand, and we're spending time after worship developing the bond and the fellowship of love with one another, and then putting into practice the things that we've learned in worship. And so if we're doing it correctly, it costs me energy. It costs me time. If we're worshiping God correctly, it costs me money. You know, not just the collection, not just the giving that takes place in the worship, but the old saying is time is money. You know, and it may be the case that we work jobs where, hey, you know, if we didn't have worship, we could pick up an extra shift. We could do some side jobs. We could travel and do some of these other things and to make more money. But those who are willing to worship God in spirit and in truth have set aside some of those opportunities to give God the devotion that He deserves. And so if we're worshiping God correctly, it might cost us some money. And worshiping God correctly costs us effort as we seek to grow and apply His truths to our lives, being doers of the Word and not hearers only. And then it'll cost us worldly opportunities as we make worship the priority. You know, when we're not out playing ball and doing all of these other kind of things on the Lord's Day or while services are taking place on the Lord's Day, we've made a decision to not pursue worldly things over spiritual things. And if we're doing worship correctly, then it'll cost us some worldly opportunities. At the end of the day, friends, what I'm submitting to you is that worship, when done correctly, cannot be a cheapened worship. It costs us something when we worship God. David understood this. David had an opportunity to offer God a worship that was going to cost him nothing. And David refused. David refused to offer God that which cost him nothing. As we think about today in this lesson, not offering to God a cheap worship, we recognize that if we're only offering to God a cheap, or dare I say, a free service, a service which cost us nothing, then friends, we're not going to grow in worship, nor are we offering God the kind of worship that He seeks. Here's what David understood and what we need to understand about a cheapened worship. David understood, and we need to understand, that a cheapened worship does not help us surmount sin. It doesn't help us overcome sin. We know that worship, true worship, builds up the follower of God. Hebrews 10 and verse 25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. And so much the more as you see the day approaching. That word exhort is akin to the word edify. We're talking about building up. We're talking about growing and strengthening and teaching. And worship does that for the follower of God. It builds them up. Paul indicated that worship even plays a role in keeping one from being spiritually weak, sick, or dead. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and Paul's primarily discussing the partaking of the Lord's Supper, but ultimately he says, because you've not been doing this correctly, there are many among you that are weak and sickly, spiritually speaking, because you've not been worshiping God correctly. The implication then is that true worship allows us to grow strong and to avoid that spiritual sickness and weakness. We recognize then that worship has a way of enabling us to stand against and to overcome, to surmount sin. David recognized that a cheap service is not able to do that. The passage of our consideration today is in 2 Samuel chapter 24. And it's revealed to us in verses 1 through 9 of this passage that David has committed a great transgression. David has taken a census. Now, 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 1 says that Satan provoked David to do this. Now, there's some debate by religious scholars as to why it was wrong. Maybe it was David's pride. You know, I've been such a great king, let me see how my kingdom has grown. Maybe it was his power. Maybe David just wanted to see the military might that he had accrued during his time as king. And maybe it was all about prestige. But in either case, David knew that what he had done was wrong. Notice 2 Samuel 24 and verse 10, it says, "And David's heart smote him after that he had numbered the people. And David said unto the Lord, I have sinned greatly in that I have done. And now I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly." David realized after taking this census that he had messed up. And as a result of this transgression, as you continue reading in 2 Samuel 24, God gives David three choices for his punishment. God says, David, you can choose either number one, 7 years of famine. Option number two, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies. And then option number three would be 3 days of pestilence. Now, David certainly doesn't want to go through 7 years of famine. David has spent a portion of his life already on the run, so he definitely doesn't want to spend 3 months fleeing from his enemies. So then that leaves option number three. David chooses door number three, the 3 days of pestilence. And most likely thinking, hey, what's the worst that could happen in 3 days? And friends, you read verses 11 through 15 of 2 Samuel 24, and you'll see that in those 3 days, 70,000 men died because of David's transgression, his sin. And it's in response to this transgression and this sin, that David is told to go and build an altar in the threshing floor of Araunah, 2 Samuel 24 and verses 18 and 19. In other words, friends, David is charged by God to offer this service, to offer this worship, in order to overcome and to move past, to surmount this sin that has taken place at David's hands. And David knew that a cheap service would never accomplish that. David knew that he had to offer to God an acceptable service, and he would not risk his life or the life of his people so that he could get off easy by offering to God a cheap service. Friends, cheap service does not help one surmount sin. David also knew that a cheap service would not only allow them to surmount sin, but that a cheap service would not strengthen his brethren. Not only does worship to God equip the saint to stand against and to overcome sin, but it's also the place where edification takes place. The people under David's rule have just endured a great loss. I mean, can you imagine for just a moment how the families of David's kingdom must have felt as 70,000 men have died? That's 70,000 sons, fathers, brothers, men from their communities. And they've died. And David, in this act where God has commanded David to now build this altar, to offer this service to Him, this is going to set the tone for what comes next. The whole nation had been impacted, and the whole nation needed strengthening. And David built this altar and made the offerings. And notice that the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. Go back with me to 2 Samuel chapter 24. And backing up to verse 22, it says, Araunah said unto David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here are oxen for burnt sacrifices, and threshing instruments, and other instruments of the oxen for wood. All these things did Araunah as a king give unto the king, and Araunah said unto the king, The Lord thy God accept thee. In other words, Araunah said, David, here's everything you need, and you can have it freely. And the king said unto Araunah, Nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and its oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Notice, so the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. Because David refused to offer a cheap service to God, the plague was stayed not only from David, but from Israel. I want you to, for just a moment, imagine if David had taken this opportunity and offered a cheap service in this moment. What would that have done to his brethren? What would that have done to Israel to see their king, who has caused this to come about, offering to God that which was cheap or worthless? Friends, not only do we sell ourselves short when we offer a cheap service, but we sell all those around us short too. I want you to imagine for a moment the family in worship that's struggling, that's done everything they could to get there on time, and the children have been fussing and everything's stressful, and now they come into worship and they're looking to you to set the tone. Think about the couple who's going through some marital trouble. They love each other and they want things to work, but they're just going through a rough patch, and now they've come into worship and they're looking at you to set the tone. Imagine the young adult in college who's hearing things from his professors that are causing him for the first time in his life to question his faith in the existence of God. And they're looking to you to set the tone in worship to God. And what they all see is someone or even a group of people offering to God a cheap worship. You never know who might be looking at you to set the tone. And you cannot strengthen brethren with a cheapened service. David realized that a cheap service would never strengthen his people. And then he realized that a cheap service would never satisfy God. You know what Cain and Nadab and Abihu and the people of Israel in Malachi's day all have in common? They all offered to God a cheapened service, and they were all rejected for it. Cain's offering, in whatever respect, was cheaper. It was less than what God had prescribed, Genesis chapter 4. And so he had no respect for it. Nadab and Abihu cheapened their service to God by offering a strange fire, and God destroyed them for it, Leviticus chapter 10. Israel in Malachi's day was offering the blind and the lame and the sick to God, Malachi chapter 1, and so God sent them away into captivity. Do you get the picture? Friends, God is not satisfied with cheap and lazy worship. David understood that. It's only after purchasing the threshing floor and the items that were needed, as we read a few moments ago, that the Lord was able to be entreated. Again, I want you to notice 2 Samuel 24 and verse 25. David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, so the Lord was entreated. The word so in this passage is kind of like when we see the word therefore. In other words, because David did this, because David made an offering which cost him something, the Lord was entreated. The ESV says, so the Lord responded. The implication, friends, is that if David had offered an inferior or a cheap service, then the Lord may not have responded. But He responded because of what David offered. Either way, David knew that the only sure way to satisfy God was offering what he could, was not settling for that which was cheap or free or that wouldn't cost him anything. Friends, God has never been satisfied with a cheapened service. If we want to satisfy God with our worship, we must offer to God that which cost us something. Our time, our energy, our effort, our hearts. Offer to God that which cost us something in worship so that God might be satisfied. And number 4, David understood that a cheapened worship would not show the proper gratitude that is due to God. At the end of the day, friends, worship is about God. Now, certainly there are benefits for us in worship, and we are the recipients of many benefits in worship. But when we assemble together to worship, we need to remember that first and foremost, the primary reason for worship is God. We are there to worship and to praise God. And the reason that a cheapened service is unacceptable is because God is worthy to be praised. Psalm 18 and verse 3. A cheapened service does not give God the honor or the reverence or the gratitude that He is due. And friends, even if you and I failed to recognize God as God, He would still be due those things. Recognizing Him then as God, how much more should we give Him the honor and reverence that He is due? I want you to consider with me for a moment another example of one who was not willing to offer to God anything less than the very best. In John 12 in verses 1 through 8, and we know this as part of what we call the Passion Week. This is the last week of Christ's life on earth before dying on the cross. And in John 12 and verses 1 through 8, Jesus is in the home of one Simon, and there is there with him Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And Mary, the sister of Lazarus, comes to anoint Jesus with a very precious ointment. John 12, verses 1 through 8. She comes and anoints Jesus with this precious ointment, this perfume, and we're told that the value of this ointment is what makes this act of benevolence so inspiring. The King James Version calls it a spikenard. The ASV and the ESV says it was of pure nard. In other words, this is the real deal. This isn't some cheap knockoff. This is the real McCoy. Nard was an ointment imported from India, and there were a lot of knockoffs that you could buy, but the writers are here telling us that this was the real stuff. We're told that its container was of alabaster, a type of marble, if you will, and in and of itself was very costly. Verse 5 tells us that this was such an expensive ointment, a perfume, that some of them murmured, and John says Judas was chief of those murmuring, not because he really cared for the poor, but because he was greedy. They were saying, we should have taken this and sold it for the poor, and Judas was leading that charge because of his greed. We're told in the text that 300 pence or denarii is what this was worth. A single pence or denarii was considered to be about a day's wage. And so you're talking about nearly a year's wage. And some translations put it as a year's wage. Can you imagine that for just a moment? Think about all of the money that you'll make through the course of a year, and taking something that has cost you that entire amount of money and pouring it out on the feet of Jesus. That's what she was willing to do. She was willing to take that which was most precious and offer it to Christ. Jesus stopped all the complaining by calling it a good work. And here it is. And for saying she has done what she could. Jesus is fixing to go to the cross. He's not going to be around forever. And He even tells them that in verse 8. And Mary did what she could, when she could, and the very best that she could. Certainly, Mary could have offered something cheaper. She could have anointed Christ for His burial with a cheaper perfume. She could have made an excuse for why she was bringing something other than this very precious ointment. As a woman in society, she probably couldn't make enough money to buy this thing. It might have been left to her by a loved one or part of her inheritance. And she could have made all kinds of excuses for why she couldn't offer this. But instead, without hesitation, she gives it to Christ. Why? Because He is worthy to be praised. And friends, a cheapened service just wouldn't have shown Christ the proper gratitude. If we're to be pleasing to God in worship, then we must not offer God a cheapened service. How can we avoid doing that? There are 4 things that we need to do in worship. Number 1, worship needs our preparation. We need to plan ahead for worship and prepare for worship. Number 2, worship needs our participation. We don't need to just be pew warmers. We need to be individuals who are singing, who are leading, who are participating in the worship service and putting heart into the service. Worship needs our dedication. Worship doesn't need to be something that we do when we have nothing better going on. Worship needs to be our priority, and we need to be dedicated to being there every opportunity that we have. And then worship needs our application as we seek to be doers of the Word and not hearers only. Do those 4 things, and we can avoid offering to God a cheapened service. I pray you've not been seeking to render to God a cheap or a free worship, It's just not good enough. Remember David, who said, I will not offer that which costs me nothing. Thank you again for tuning in today, and God bless.
Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of mine. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of mine. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer pardon and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus, only Savior, sanctified forever. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life.
Do you have any questions about the Bible? Are you searching for a place to worship God like you find in the Bible? Do you have questions about your eternity? Would you like to know more about God's plan for you? Let me encourage you to visit a Church of Christ near you today. And if you're interested in learning more about the Lord's church, we also offer free material. For more information, or if you would like to have a transcript or a copy of today's program, whether audio or video, please go to our website at www.bible-talk.org, or you can email us at bible.talk@bible-talk.org. You can also write to us at Bible Talk, P.O. Box 40, Fayette, Alabama 35555. Simply include the program number, and we'll be happy to send that to you completely free of charge. Thank you again for tuning in, and may God bless you richly in your walk with Him. Singing provided by the Edmond Church of Christ, Edmond, Oklahoma, producers of In Search of the Lord's Way. You can visit their website at www.searchtv.org.